Indeed, it has been said that in some of our major urban A&Es, over 70% of those presenting themselves for treatment between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. at weekends are intoxicated with alcohol. And indeed, to check this out, one day I went to Craigavon Area Hospital and I went unannounced and anonymous. Though I find it quite hard to remain anonymous in hospitals these days. But I sat in A&E and it was packed. This was about 2 in the morning. It was a Saturday night stroke Sunday morning. It was absolutely packed. And at the end of my 2 hours sitting there, I reckon the only people who were sober in that room were me and the nurse. And the nurse, I think, was rapidly being driven to alcohol herself. And I thought to myself, the vast majority of those folk would not have been there if it wasn't for alcohol abuse. In my own area, Down Hospital, the average A&E number of people reporting for A&E between 12 midnight and 6 a.m. is 4 on a Monday to Friday. That quadruples on a Saturday and Sunday. Yet there's no change in the climate, no change in people's diet, but there's abuse of alcohol. So we have that aspect which is great concern, and the committee are looking at. Secondly, we had a very worrying meeting in the room next door a year ago, where the Health Committee met all the leading cancer specialists in Northern Ireland. And one gentleman was a specialist in liver cancer, and he told us a very, very worrying statistic. He told me that there is a very high spike of liver cancer patients coming through the system who are young males. Well, they were young, they're now in their 40s, and they are reporting very serious liver cancer. And the reason for the liver cancer, the one thing that's in common with the vast majority of them, is not only high levels of consumption of alcohol, but binge drinking. Now, I'm sure no one in this room knows what I'm talking about when it's binge drinking. You're all highly moral, upstanding members of society. But this is the more modern trend of going in to a pub or a club or a restaurant, well, mostly clubs, weekends, and drinking very high intense levels of alcohol. We're told by the medical experts that if you spread the same consumption over a 7-day period, it is not that damaging. But that when you concentrate it in 2 or 3 evenings a week, it causes huge problems as far as liver is concerned. Even more worrying, after he told us that, was that coming behind that cohort of males who have liver cancer, which, by the way, is a very nasty form of cancer, and sometimes, quite often, fatal. Coming behind 5 years' time, behind that in 5 years' time, is a cohort of females who were also binge drinkers in their teens and 20s, who are suffering from liver cancer. Now, liver cancer normally does not affect people in that age group. It's mostly an older person's disease. But and the one common element has been abuse of alcohol. So we have a problem. Our justice system, I'm on the Justice Committee, our justice system is having huge problems with abuse of alcohol. My brother was a PSNI officer, formerly RUC, for many years, and he said to me that if it wasn't for alcohol in his station, which was Cookstown, on a Friday, Saturday and Sunday night, frankly, there'd be very little of anything for the police to do. That the vast majority of the call-outs they had, be they domestic, be they street violence, be they just purely drunken in charge, etc., were caused by alcohol abuse. So therefore, what's the Assembly doing? Well, the Assembly takes this extremely serious. The Health Committee, in conjunction with its colleagues in DSD, take this extremely seriously. And we're looking very hard at minimum pricing. There is absolutely no doubt, I'm sure you've all read the Sheffield University research into this, there's absolutely no doubt that there is a direct link between the pricing of alcohol and consumption. Now, what's unusual about that doesn't happen with cigarettes and soft drugs, where there doesn't seem to be any link whatsoever between the cost of the product and consumption. But with alcohol, there very much is. And we know that if we increase the minimum price by a certain level, consumption will go down by a certain level. And the suggestion is that we move to a 40 or a 45 pence minimum price per unit of alcohol. All the evidence from elsewhere has shown that that has quite dramatic impacts. Now, that doesn't mean that folk in this audience and most folk at Stormont have anything to worry about, because frankly, you're paying the 40 pence or the 45 pence anyhow. If you're going to your local restaurant or bar or club, you're paying well above the minimum price. But what it will stop is loss-leading selling by supermarkets to young people who get tanked up before they go out for the night. The trend is that young people will go into the Lidls and the Asdas of this world. They will buy alcohol, which is in real terms 60% cheaper than it was in 1972. They will buy alcohol often cheaper than bottled water. They will drink large amounts and then they will go out and buy the more expensive drink in the pubs and clubs. And that seems to be what's fueling an awful lot of the damage it's causing both to the health of our young people and, of course, the resultant problems with violence and antisocial behaviour afterwards. Now, I know that when we propose this, the big guns of the Diageos of this world will move in and oppose it. We expect that. But I think we have to hold firm. I think we owe it to society to try and bring this problem well and truly under control. So therefore, I welcome one of the themes of the discussions today is how to teach young people responsible drinking. If they're going to drink, well, at least inspire them to drink in a very socially moderate way and not go down the route where I have to say, in hard-bitten, vulnerable communities in South Down, the concept of moderate social drinking is a total anathema to many young people. People talk to me that young people are becoming more responsible. Well, I'll take you to somewhere like Downpatrick or Kilkeel on a Sunday morning at 2 a.m. and I want you to show me the responsible drinkers in those streets. I'd love you to show them to me. I'd like to take you to a certain club which will remain totally nameless in Banbridge and watch them coming out of that at 1:30 in the morning. And I'd like you to interview 100 young people and find how many of them have been responsible in their drinking in that institution. I think you'll find it very, very difficult. I see a lot of worried parents standing outside waiting to get their children home in pretty awful states. So therefore, I think it's important as academics and as intellectuals that you look at this issue and see, is there some way we can plot a pathway to enable our young people to develop a sensible approach. Now, I'll just finish with this. I have been in England for many conferences, things like British-Irish Association. I go to Oxford, Cambridge, I go to London. And on Saturday and Sunday night, I see exactly the same thing there amongst young people. I don't see it so much amongst people from the 50-plus age group, but amongst young people, there's a problem in those societies as well. So it's not a Celtic thing. It's something that is very much part of our culture. I go to Iceland, and it's practically unheard of. I go to Sweden, I never see it. It seems to be a particularly British Isles issue. But to lighten things up, I have to tell you a little story. Dr. Paisley, MEP, who was here for many years and was First Minister, cannot say that he never touched alcohol for 87 years of his life. Alcohol has never crossed his lips. How many people can say that? And one night he was giving a lecture on the evils of booze in the Martyrs Memorial Church in Belfast. And he took a glass of water and a glass of Bushmills. And he dropped a worm into the glass of water, and the little worm swam around perfectly happily. He took the same worm and he dropped it into a glass of Bushmills, and it dropped to the bottom of the glass, stone dead. And he said, "Members of this parish, what does this prove?" And somebody at the back shouted out, "If you have worms, drink Bushmills." So hopefully it'll not all be gloom and doom. I could tell you half a dozen drink stories, but I haven't time to go back to speak to these chaps from Yemen who are next door who definitely don't take alcohol. I wish you all the best in your conference. It's a very serious subject, and I know the Health Committee will benefit, as we do enormously, from the tremendous backup we have here from the research team. We have the best research team in the United Kingdom. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. And everywhere I go, every conference I go, I get a tremendous briefing from our research team. So therefore, some of them are represented here today, and I hope that they will pick up on some of what you have to say, and that will help us as we move into this difficult issue of how we control this almost plague, I'd have to say, of alcohol abuse in our province. And if we can come to some form of agreement and some form of way forward that everyone can sign up to as a result of efforts like this, then it's money very well spent. Thank you.
Drinking alcohol is possibly the most dangerous thing which society allows of its citizens. Some of the dangers, some of the harms have already been listed off just now. To that list you could add specific diseases, cirrhosis of the liver, specific range of cancers, specific statistics on road collisions, on the volume of domestic abuse to which alcohol is a contributing factor. You could continue ad nauseum, and some of these harms are things which we will explore explicitly. But a point to make is that we allow this as a society. Alcohol is a drug which we collectively privilege in our society. It is an unusual drug in that we allow the economy to benefit from it, and we allow our culture to harmonise with it. Well, who the hell am I? And who the hell are we? Well, I'm John Moriarty, and this is Andy Percy, and we're here this afternoon with sort of 4 aims in mind. We want to stimulate a debate around the policies that we hold towards alcohol in our society, and to inform that debate, to show you how science is catching up with the social phenomenon of alcohol, to challenge how often we discuss the drinking of underage people as if it's an alien phenomenon from the drinking which takes place in our wider culture, and to provide some method and some tools by which we can start to think through in a clear and quality way some of the interventions which we might propose. There'll be time in the questions to address some of the specific themes that have already been raised. But I'll just tell you very briefly how I arrived at an interest in this topic. My PhD research was not on alcohol use, it was on illegal substance use and the use of cannabis among young people. And as part of this, I visited Australia, and one of the things I wanted to do in Australia was explore the theme of harm reduction, speak to people like the audience members here who are involved in the front line of policy making, speak to some people who deliver addiction services. And I was curious about illegal drugs and what is the sort of third way that Australia has pioneered since the 1980s, away from the punitive response towards drugs and more towards an emphasis on reducing the harm which accrues from drug use. And in terms of illegal drug use, that is usually related to intercepting supply, quality education, things which are more analogous to how we teach sexual education, where ideally young people would not be doing this, but if they are to be doing it, well, here are the safest ways, here are the ways to minimise the harm which accrue from this behaviour. And I wanted to talk about all this and find about how it came about. And everybody I sat down with, I asked them, well, could you, just tell me what the state of play is, sort of 30 years on into the harm reduction model. And they would instantly, without any prompting, start talking about alcohol. And sometimes 20 minutes in, I would have to go, I'm just going to switch the focus onto illegal drugs, but we would have 20 minutes of unprompted conversation about alcohol as the major issue in Australian social life and in Australian society, and the challenge that it has laid down to society and the innovative research which has come out of it. And that some of that is what I'm going to discuss with you today, is when we set about reducing harms, we don't want necessarily to eliminate the phenomenon, eliminate the behaviour. Well, what we want somebody to do, to people to be doing, is doing something in the least harmful possible way. But harm is such a fraught concept, because we, in terms of measuring, in terms of measuring alcohol use as a phenomenon, we have basically 3 very crude measures. We have the pound sign costs to society, we have death tolls, and we have units. But the unit of alcohol in which we serve it isn't a unit at all in the way that science would recognize it. It's pure in that each unit affects each person completely differently. So, harm reduction and harm minimization is fraught because often we are ill-equipped to calculate the harm which accrues from a given phenomenon. So, how do we go about understanding harms and costs of alcohol use? Well, there's 3 main routes to estimation. One is at the individual level, where we aggregate, we find out how many people are affected and to what extent by alcohol use, and that tends to go along the lines that have already been mentioned, such as disease, cost to one's own productivity, mental health, addiction, and so on. And as I say, in some of the extreme instances, people who die directly as a consequence from their own alcohol use. This misses a vast amount of nuance. This misses the broader harm to society, because society is not made up of all the individuals there within, and it would miss, if you were to only calculate the cost to individuals, it would miss the bill footed by their fellow citizens and their fellow taxpayers for their medical treatment. The other people whose medical treatment has to be deprioritized because medical treatment has to be given to somebody else. And again, I must emphasize that these are things which we bear collectively as an adult and a teenage population together. And it is almost the first step in facing up to the phenomenon of adolescents and young people drinking, is to recognize the vast effects of all people's drinking, because many people will be listening to me and saying, well, de-identifying with the kind of harms that I'm describing, and saying that they are not themselves necessarily, that their own drinking doesn't harm themselves and people in that way. But that's dangerous thinking, as we'll go on to see, because people's drinking is interlinked. And your own drinking, the harms, as I say, do not stop with yourself. So comparing the harms borne to the individuals themselves to those borne by others is the great project which is underway. And there's a report which I give some details in the paper that I've circulated by Laslett and colleagues, in which they calculate and come up, to skip to the punchline, come up with an estimation of costs to others compared to those borne by the drinkers themselves at equal, if not more, amount of the costs borne in total by alcohol is borne by people other than the individual themselves from the so the loss of productivity in the workplace, which has to be then made up by one's colleagues, work colleagues. So people within the household who are affected, whose mental health are directly affected, people in the family who witness alcohol use, whose family budget may be augmented to support the drinking of another person. Then there's strangers, which we could also call fellow citizens, who may have to move area, or whose quality of life and own mental health may be affected by disturbance of sleep, effects on the sanitation of their of the area, damage which they have to pay for if in the case of private property, or in the case of public damage which all fellow citizens have to collectively make amends for. And then, of course, there's the people that we care about the most, the friends, family, the people who are most directly influenced, or are most directly witnessed and most directly affected. So this model, I mean, this is a game changer in the sense that when you illustrate that drinking is not solely an individual choice, it has an externality of a magnitude that really entitles fellow citizens to have a say on whether you should be allowed to drink each successive unit that you wish to drink or not. But there is still a lot missing from this model, and this is the state of where we are now and where we need to go next in terms of having a really robust model by which we could measure the effectiveness of any intervention to try and curtail these harms. So what we're still missing is the extent to which one person's decision to drink causes another person to make the same decision, and the degree to which the harms are multiplicative through social influence and through cultural influence. We have some good estimates in terms of the extent to which, and estimates among young people suggest that, okay, if you have 10 close friends, every successive friend that decides to drink increases your likelihood of drinking by 3%. So it's 10% to 3% ratio. But as those accrue, so with each passing individual, these start to grow exponentially, and eventually the likelihood when all of your friends start to drink of you drinking, or the likelihood if you are somebody's only friend of your peer drinking because of yours, starts to grow past the 30% aggregate of all the friends drinking effects. So when we consider people in isolation drinking quote unquote responsibly, firstly we have to consider that the amount that they're drinking affects them in a certain way. But if somebody else drinks, say in a social situation, to keep pace with them, well, they're being affected in a different way according to their own genetic makeup, according to their own resilience. They have a different propensity to addiction. They have a different genetic makeup to the person who is influencing them. So I, as one individual, can make a decision solely based on reasoning on how this will affect me and my own knowledge of my body and so on. But if I haven't been educated to consider the effects on the people around me And as I say, the people closest to me, friends and family on whom I'm influencing, I am underestimating the cost intrinsically of the decision that I'm making. So while some of this sounds quite stark in terms of harming other people, in a sense, some of this information is quite a strong weapon as an educational tool, because I would posit that you can leverage this concept of cost and this concept of harming other people when you're speaking to younger people and to people around their decisions to drink and to drink to excess, in terms of, well, you may think that you know the extent to which you will be harmed. You think you know your body and you know your drinking, but you cannot guarantee that there won't be greater harms to other people. So we would augment the model somewhat to differentiate between direct harm, the harm which my drinking and the behaviours that part of that repertoire have on the people immediately around me and the people in my society, and then the influence mechanism which my drinking has on the other people, which in turn will accrue harms at a similar rate, which would lead us to suggest that the harms to others are still being underestimated, even at 50% of the total cost. That harms out that we need to factor into the distinction between harms to oneself and harms to others, the harms which are accrued socially through influencing one another. There's a few. In most of these are two-way influence interactions, but in the case of strangers, you can influence somebody and you can directly harm somebody. You generally influence the people who are close to you. Children and young people within the household are generally the most asymmetrically affected by other people's alcohol use. And we should consider this when we consider the harm of young people drinking themselves, that young people are themselves the ones who are most affected by other people's drinking, because they are influenced to drink themselves on the one hand and often directly harmed as a consequence of alcohol use. There's more missing in this model though, which is there isn't necessarily, as I say, a good and a clear way to distinguish between a person drinking at a low level, a moderate level, and a high level. The different levels of harms need to be considered in terms of what point of drinking activates these harms. So at what point, the one drink described earlier may only activate some of the harms. We know it does activate some of the harms, such as increased risk to health and some of the increased risk to other behaviours, which is the reason for some of the drink driving limits being changed in the last number of years. We know that the one drink does have harms attached to it, but the set-off point for some of the other harms will be borne out not through instance of drinking, not through frequency of drinking, but through intensity. So a distinction in our policy between frequency and intensity and a targeting of those is something which needs to be included in this model as well. So we don't have that research yet. That is a gap. That's a gap in our knowledge. We have theoretical. For example, we know that in instances of child abuse, we know that there's 33% approximately involvement. But we know that also the child abuse is particularly is particularly targeted by people who drink at a very high level. So like at a 4 or 6 as a female, or 6 drinks per day consistently. These are the points at which the risk of child abuse starts to target off. So, but we need one of those for each possible harm. We need to know the threshold at which this harm activates. And the last thing we need to know is we need not to think of all harms being born in the immediate. We need to integrate our understanding of intensity and of frequency. So consider the thought experiment of somebody who gives up drink for November and then drinks a lot in December, which is not uncommon. How much of these would be how much of the harms averted by the drink taken in December would be averted by the same amount net volume being taken over 60 days rather than 31. That hands me over to Andy.
I'm going to speak briefly regarding attempts to translate the empirical knowledge that we have about alcohol-related harms and the risk factors which generate those harms, and how we translate those into effective policy aimed specifically at trying to reduce those harms. And I've been in the sort of prevention field now for, I'd say, going on 30 years. And in essence, sort of looking back over the years, I don't think we've made actually that much progress in terms of developing a prevention policy and practice aimed at reducing the alcohol-related harms that John spoke about. And reflecting on it recently, I'm coming increasingly to the conclusion that one of the problems that causes this sort of lack of effective policy is the ways in which researchers communicate our findings to policymakers and practitioners. And I think we make a major error when trying to engage in knowledge exchange of reducing the complexity in terms of the research that we have. And we do this in three ways. I think we reduce the diversity in our research findings. We downplay continuity between adolescent and alcohol consumption, and we dismiss social context. The first one, in terms of reducing diversity, every longitudinal research study that I have looked at shows a considerable heterogeneity within drinking behaviours amongst both adolescents and amongst adults, and considerable heterogeneity in terms of the outcomes of drinking behaviour. But one of the things that we do as researchers when trying to engage in knowledge exchanges, we reduce alcohol consumption to a binary distinction between the drinker and the non-drinker. Most research will look at the outcomes for excessive alcohol consumption, but when we tend to talk about the findings from excessive alcohol consumption, we tend to drop the word excessive and talk about alcohol consumption per se and how it differs from non-drinking. In terms of the continuity, we have a tendency also to, as was in a way in which we try to hype up our own findings, we tend to portray teenage drinking as something which is qualitatively different from adult drinking. We talk about sort of uncontrolled hedonism amongst young people. We use lots of gaudy images of drunk teenagers lying around city centres, most of which I'm now becoming increasingly convinced are all staged by professional photographers. And we view teenagers today as something fundamentally different from ourselves as adults, and also something fundamentally different from ourselves when we were teenagers. And in the last one, in terms of social context, and this is something which I think psychologists in particular are very guilty of, is that we tend to portray problems associated with drinking as being located within the individual, and we ignore the social context that exists around the individual. And as a result, therefore, when we propose solutions to those problems, we see those solutions as being located within the individual, that it's the individual that needs to change. What I want to do is explore each of these 3 points in turn. And what I want to do is by examining the sort of often neglected case of the moderate teenage drinker. And I want to put those forward as a case study by which to explore the diversity in drinking, continuity, and the impact of social contexts. If you read any of the sort of research on prevalence of teenage drinking, and particularly longitudinal studies looking at changes in drinking behaviour over time amongst teenagers, every study will clearly show that the majority of adolescents are not high-volume extreme drinkers, nor are they abstainers, but they fall within this generally middle group of moderate alcohol drinkers. All longitudinal studies show a group of teenagers who appear to be able to show a degree of control or self-regulation over their alcohol consumption. Within my own research, we clearly identify these sort of moderate drinking groups within the surveys that we do of teenagers, and also within our qualitative studies, where we sit down and interview teenagers in depth. We find that we identify groups who are moderate drinkers. Such diversity in teenage drinking suggests to me potential diversity in the long-term outcomes associated with different adolescent alcohol problems. And there are ways in which we can test to see the extent to which these the heterogeneity in teenage consumption is linked to heterogeneity in adult drinking outcomes. This slide shows represents analysis that I undertook looking at data from the British cohort study, the 1970 cohort study, which has tracked a large number of children from birth up into adulthood. And what I'm particularly interested in here is their drinking behaviour at age 16 and their drinking behaviour at age 26, so 10 years later. What we do is we take teenagers at age 16 and we look at the units they consume, the frequency of their drinking, the number of alcohol-related harms they have experienced, and the number of heavy binge sessions that they engage in. And we classify, using a method known as latent class analysis, into these sort of categories or classes of drinking. Hazardous drinkers, heavy, moderate, occasional, limited. Hazardous drinkers would be young people that are drinking more than twice a week, tend to be drinking high volumes of alcohol when they are drinking, are experiencing alcohol-related harms as a result of their drinking. Moderate drinkers, in contrast, would be drinking at no more than once a week, would be consuming lower levels of alcohol and not experiencing any alcohol-related harm. When we look at the numbers of units that they consume at age 26, the frequency of heavy drinking sessions, mental health, socioeconomic status, and a range of other outcomes, we find out that, interestingly, teenagers who were moderate drinkers at age 16 are moderate drinkers at age 26. This slide here shows the differences in the numbers of units consumed amongst males within the sample at age 26. You will see that moderate drinkers are missing from this. The way this graph is produced is that they're our benchmark group. So they're artificially set to 0, and then we can look at the differences in alcohol consumption of the other groups around in comparison to moderate drinkers. And we see here that heavy drinkers drink around about 150 units per year more than those individuals who were moderate drinkers in teenage years. Those who were hazardous drinkers at age 16 drink around about 250 units more than moderate drinkers 10 years later. And likewise, we see occasional drinkers are around about 40 units less than moderate drinkers, and limited drinkers are around about 120 units on average less than moderate drinkers. But what's important to understand in this here is that these are estimates of drinking behaviour controlling for a wide range of other factors which may impact on alcohol consumption. And the black bars are the confidence intervals that exist around those estimates. And what's interesting about, if you look at the confidence intervals around occasional and limited drinkers, is that they both contain the moderate drinkers. There is no significant difference between moderate drinkers and occasional and limited drinkers 10 years after their first assessment. So there's no significant difference in drinking behaviour in mid-adulthood. There are significant differences between heavy and hazardous drinkers. If we were to repeat this analysis for all the other outcomes which we look at, we also find that moderate drinkers are moderate drinking is not associated with poor educational outcomes, increase in malaise, smoking behaviour, socioeconomic status, pay, employment status, and other health and social harms. There appears to be very few early adult outcomes, or negative outcomes associated with moderate drinking in teenage years. And to the extent I would argue is that there is a little difference, in fact, between moderate, occasional and limited drinkers in terms of their risk for negative outcomes in adulthood. So moving on to the second point around continuity, how different is teenage drinking from adult drinking? We tend to portray teenage drinkers as hordes of young people out of control, drinking themselves to oblivion. Something very distinct from adults. And I'm not going to suggest that there are not young people out there that engage in that behaviour, but they are a minority. And when you ask teenagers themselves why they consume alcohol, they report back to us saying that they drink to be sociable, to celebrate, to commiserate, to relax, to have a good time. They drink for all the same reasons that adults drink. And they enjoy the loss of inhibitions and fun that's associated with being drunk. It's the intoxicating effect of alcohol that allows them to experience all the fun parts of it. I would argue is that they drink for exactly the same reasons as adults drink. When we go home of an evening after a hard day at work and we sit down and we have a glass of wine, we are drinking wine because of the mood-altering effects of that. We may not be drinking to intoxication, but we are benefiting from the mood-altering impacts of alcohol consumption. And to an extent, teenagers are as well. But these teenagers have limits on the level of intoxication that they're interested in achieving when they're drinking. Fiona Measham did a really interesting study where she just asked young people who were going out drinking, nightclubs in Manchester, to, on a scale of 1 to 100, to list how drunk they intended to get that evening. And you find that very few individuals came anywhere close to ticking 100. In fact, for most teenagers, you ask them, things like passing out, being sick, getting into fights, having to be taken home by your friends are all very highly embarrassing outcomes for them and things to be avoided at all costs. They're indications of individuals who they consider to be poor drinkers that are not able to handle their alcohol. And in fact, these types of uncontrolled drinking outcomes tend to ruin all the fun that young people are interested in obtaining. And to an extent, this is very similar to adults when we drink. We are not particularly interested in getting into fights when we go out on a work evening. The one problem with teenage drinkers is that, like adults, they use a range of different strategies for monitoring and regulating their alcohol consumption. It's just that teenagers tend to be poorer at doing it than adults are. They're less skilled at regulating their alcohol consumptions, and lots of the strategies that they do use tend to fail, and they do get into problems and difficulties. And I think one of the challenges for us is that, as researchers, is to accept that we allow young people to develop these regulation skills through trial and error, of making mistakes and learning from them. But those mistakes actually then expose moderate drinkers to real social harms. And those mistakes arise from young people overshooting the level of intoxication that they're intended. And then just to finish off, I just want to look at social context. As researchers, we collect data from individuals. We analyse it as individuals. We produce graphs based on individuals, and we recommend and design interventions exclusively for individuals, which ignores the simple fact that the vast majority, or virtually all, of teenage drinking is done in groups. Teenagers do not drink. This is the one difference, I think, between teenagers and alcohol and adults, is that teenagers very rarely ever drink on their own. They drink as part of groups. Those peer groups develop a stable drinking culture. And I would argue is that if we are going to provide interventions to reduce the harm associated with adolescent drinking, we need to be delivering that to the groups of young people who drink together. I would also argue is that not only is it the people that they're drinking with, but also the places that they're drinking, which also impact on alcohol-related harm. The main one being that most of the skills and strategies that young people use to regulate their consumption are very context dependent. When you ask young people about when they've got into trouble with alcohol, when they've had problems arising for them, one of the sort of regular themes that comes out is the first time that they ever drank at a house party, first time they ever drank in a bar, or when they've gone on holidays abroad for the first time. And I would argue is that the strategies that young people use for regulating their consumption in one context do not transfer into another context. The classic one being is that if you know how much alcohol you can drink and you buy that and you're drinking on the street, you can be very certain as to how drunk you will get. But the first time that you go into a bar, and not only are you're no longer limited to just that alcohol that you've bought at the start of the night, but you can continue to drink for as long as you want. That's when the strategies that young people use for regulating alcohol consumption break down and young people get into difficulty. So just to finish off, I would argue the implications of this is that when, as researchers, we're making recommendations about future policy, is that we make those recommendations recognising and embracing the complexity involved in teenage development and the complexities involved in teenage drinking behaviour, and that we do not try to reduce that complexity to make messages more user-friendly to other audiences, because I think that distorts the messages which we are saying around it, and that leads to ineffective policy being developed. I would argue that we need strategies to reduce consumption amongst heavy and hazardous drinkers. They're the ones that are going to face the severe long-term problems as a result of their drinking. But for moderate drinkers, I would argue is that rather than focusing on the long-term consequences of their consumption, we should be trying to reduce the harms associated with acute intoxication. I would argue that for moderate drinkers, we shouldn't be telling them to stop drinking or to reduce their drinking. We should be teaching them to drink better, to be better consumers of alcohol, to avoid the trial and error problems. And those interventions should be based on groups of young people who are drinking, rather delivered that as individual interventions. Thanks.